It is 6:30 in the morning on September 18, 1926. The streets of Miami are quiet. Flooded, yes. Branches down, a few tiles scattered across the road, but quiet. The wind has stopped. The barometer has stopped falling. The sky has lightened to a bruised, eerie gray, and along Biscayne Bay, people are beginning to come out of their houses. They have made it through the storm, or so they believe. Men in wet trousers step onto front porches. Families emerge from garages and church halls. On Bayshore Drive, a crowd gathers at the waterfront, marveling at the wreckage. Cars are overturned. Sailboats are in the middle of the road. But the rain has stopped and the air is still. And that stillness feels like safety. It is not safety. The eye of the Great Miami Hurricane had just passed over downtown Miami. The lull lasted roughly 35 minutes. For tens of thousands of people who had never lived through a hurricane before, newcomers drawn to South Florida by the greatest real estate boom in American history, those 35 minutes were a death trap. They didn't know what the silence meant. Richard Gray, the head of the Miami Weather Bureau office, would later record that the streets became crowded with people during the lull. Some began driving back from shelters to check on their homes. Others simply stood outside and looked at the sky. Then, around 7 o'clock in the morning, the back wall of the hurricane arrived. The Great Miami Hurricane had been born 11 days earlier, on September 11th, as a tropical wave far out in the central Atlantic Ocean, a classic Cape Verde storm. It was a powerful, well-organized system that intensified rapidly as it tracked westward. By September 15th, it had reached major hurricane strength north of the Virgin Islands. By the 16th, it was a Category 4, with peak sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. It passed through the Turks and Caicos and roared through the Bahamas. In those days, before satellites, before reconnaissance aircraft, the only way to track a storm was from ship reports. And this one moved fast enough that warnings barely kept pace. Miami's Weather Bureau didn't post hurricane warnings until 11 o'clock the night of September 17th, less than 8 hours before landfall. By then, most of the 200,000 people in the storm's path were asleep, having lived through a smaller storm earlier that summer, and thinking they understood what a hurricane was. They didn't. The hurricane made landfall just before dawn on September 18th, coming ashore near Perrine, about 15 miles south of downtown Miami. The first half of the storm hit from the northeast, pushing walls of water ahead of it. Miami Beach was, in the words of writer Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, isolated in a sea of raving white water. Former Fort Lauderdale Mayor M.A. Hort described what he saw on Las Olas Boulevard. Waves several feet high were rolling up Las Olas Boulevard, which had the appearance of a river rather than a street. Practically the entire town was covered with 3 feet of water. Then the eye passed, the streets filled with people, and then the back wall hit. Winds reached 128 miles per hour, possibly as high as 140 to 150, according to the Weather Bureau. The anemometer at the Miami station blew away at 8:12 in the morning while recording 120 miles per hour. Whatever came after that, there was no instrument left to measure it. The second half was worse than the first. Onshore southeasterly winds drove a 10-foot storm surge across Miami Beach and through Biscayne Bay, flooding city blocks of downtown Miami. Near Coconut Grove, the surge reached nearly 15 feet. Utility poles hurled through the air. Roofs tore from buildings and sailed down streets. Every building in downtown Miami was damaged or destroyed. Across South Florida, the scene was catastrophic. D.L. Gregory, sheltering in Hollywood with real estate agent Floyd Ray, watched through a window as half a house went down the street, then a whole garage, then cars standing exposed as their garages were lifted off them entirely. Salt water came in horizontal sheets so thick you couldn't see the house next door. When the storm finally moved on, it left behind a city that had been shattered. The Red Cross reported 372 deaths, though more than 800 people were listed as missing in the aftermath. Many of them newcomers with no local ties, swept into the Everglades and never found. Over 6,000 were injured. 2,000 homes were destroyed outright, another 3,000 damaged. Between 25,000 and 47,000 people were homeless, and that was only Miami. To the north, in Moore Haven, a small farming town on the southern shore of Lake Okeechobee, The storm surge from the lake burst through the earthen dikes that were supposed to protect the town. Water rose 13 to 15 feet. People scrambled to rooftops but were swept away. The Red Cross found 150 bodies in Moorhaven alone. Many were never recovered, carried deep into the sawgrass of the Everglades by the retreating water. Property damage totaled $105 million in 1926 dollars. Adjusted for wealth and inflation, that figure exceeds $164 billion today. The United States Weather Service described it as probably the most destructive storm in the history of the United States. The hurricane would continue its path of destruction, crossing the Gulf of Mexico and making a second landfall near Pensacola on September 20th, tearing apart virtually every pier, warehouse, and vessel on Pensacola Bay, then pushing weakened but still dangerous into Mississippi and Louisiana. But its most consequential damage had already been done, because the Great Miami Hurricane did not merely destroy buildings, it destroyed a myth. South Florida in 1926 was in the grip of the greatest land boom America had ever seen. Prices were doubling and tripling. Miami's population had exploded, a 440% increase in a single decade. Newspapers ran ads claiming Miami Beach had practically no danger from summer storms. Investors poured in from across the country, buying and selling lots on land they'd never seen, confident the money would never stop. The hurricane ended all of that. Within months of the storm, thousands of newcomers cleared out their bank accounts and left the state. Banks teetered on the edge of collapse. Planned developments were abandoned. Land values collapsed. South Florida sank into economic depression 3 full years before the rest of the country would follow. The Great Miami Hurricane of 1926 ended the Florida land boom. And it didn't just reshape the economy, it changed how America builds and prepares. Miami appointed a chief building inspector who created what became the first enforced building code in the United States, a model that spread to more than 5,000 cities. The state legislature created the Okeechobee Flood Control District. Flood control infrastructure was rebuilt, and hurricane forecasting was changed forever. The disaster made plain what happens when a massive, fast-moving storm catches a population of newcomers who have no idea what is coming. The University of Miami started its first classes just a few weeks after the storm, built on the optimism of the land boom, opening its doors into the ruins of that optimism. It spent its first 15 years struggling financially. That is the Great Miami Hurricane of 1926, a storm that arrived without adequate warning, killed hundreds, displaced tens of thousands, and ended an era. A storm that was, in the words of the National Hurricane Center, probably the costliest hurricane in American history when measured against the wealth of its time. And a storm that is still remembered today as the moment when South Florida first understood what it means to live at the edge of the Atlantic.